So I see a number of you brought your Bibles, and that's a good thing. This is kind of a bring your Bible to Bible class. And if you have it on your phone, that's a good place to find it. You can go to BibleGateway.com, BlueLetterBible.com. You can download for free an app called Olive Tree. They've got at least a few free Bibles on there, although there'll be some for purchase. Those are all reasonable places to find. As I had said, I think last time when I introduced this, mostly I'll be following the New International Version, the 1984 edition of that, not the 2011 edition, but they're not that far apart, especially in the Old Testament. So if you have a 2011, that'd be fine too. But you use the Bible you're comfortable with. I actually, when I'm teaching a Bible class that's going through a book of the Bible, well, any Bible class, if it's a bring your Bible to Bible class kind of class, it's good to have different translations out there because they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes you get some insights into the original language as you look at what the translators chose to do with some particular section. Also probably be good to have the sheets here. I'm not going to try to put chapter after chapter after chapter up on the PowerPoint slides. That doesn't work so well. Next Sunday, we had announced we're going to do this Sunday of the Passion, which will start off with a Palm Sunday, but it's going to review the whole Passion history. And instead of seeing it serialized over the whole season of Lent, you'll get it all in one Sunday, interspersed there too. I've got service folders printed. They've got the Bible readings in the service folder. You're going to want one of those. I'm not going to try to put them all up in PowerPoint. It's a lot of PowerPoint slides to try to flip through. So the Bible readings will not be on the screen next Sunday, but they will be in your service folder for ease of following along if you don't want to just sit and listen. Okay, so this introductory thing, we had talked about the goal last time. We're going to make ourselves familiar with the prophets, times, the general outline of the book, and that will help us to interpret better, understand some things about genre. I didn't talk about it here in this introductory lesson. One of the things is that as with most of the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah is writing in poetry, in Hebrew poetry, which is just a different animal. We'll talk a little bit about that when we actually see some of the text in front of us, but it's all in poetry. And you have to understand that that's the genre to interpret correctly also. In English too, we do things a little differently in poetry than we do in everyday speech, and you know that. You often use archaic words in poetry because you need a rhyming word, and there is no everyday word that rhymes, and so you grab for that. And you put things in weird word orders in order to get the rhyming word out at the end like you want it, and to get the rhythm that you want. You don't put it in the normal word order. You've got that in the hymn sometimes, and you're used to singing it, but if you were to actually just read it out loud, you'd think, boy, that's weird. And so we'll have some of those things along the way. But it's good to get this introductory material in order to better be able to interpret. We gotten into the first section there about Isaiah the man, and then after that we hadn't really moved any farther. So today I want to move through this whole introductory lesson. Just quickly, for those of you who weren't here last time, Isaiah's name means the Lord is salvation. In many ways, it's got a lot of things going that are similar to the name of Jesus or Joshua, except just inverted in order. But the Lord of salvation is the name of Isaiah in English if you translate it. His family, he is said to be the father of Amos. That's how he identifies himself by Jewish tradition. Amos was the brother of Jewish king Amaziah, which would make Isaiah king, cousin to the king at the time he began his ministry, which is during the reign of Uzziah. And then down the line, that means that Isaiah was related to the royal clan, the royal family. And that's probably why he has access to these kings in the way that he does. If you read some of the other prophets, they have prophecies towards the king, and they might win an audience with him from time to time, but there's not this regular interaction with the kings as you find with Isaiah. And that's likely because he's a relative, and he's part of the royal family. That, of course, also assumes that he's a Judahite. He's from the tribe of Judah. His wife is simply referred to in the book as the prophetess. I said high likelihood because her two sons have names that were given to them that bore a prophetic announcement or message to God's people, and those two sons were Sher Jashub, which means a remnant will return, and that is a big theme of Isaiah, especially in chapters 40 to the end, 40 through 66. He is announcing, well, in fact, today's sermon later is on Isaiah 43, and there the announcement of the return from the exile in Babylon is in view. Sher Jashub, a remnant will return, is one of his sons' names. The other one, Mahashalal Hashbaz, which is quick to plunder, swift to spoil, which also has a kind of a gospel meaning for the people of his day, but announces victory. Anyway, so that's his family, and then his work seems from 2 Chronicles chapters 26 and 32 that he also served at times as court historian. And when we get to chapters 38, 39, 37, 38, 39, it's going to be very different. Now we're going to switch from poetic prophecy to history. And he is telling the story in words very close to what you have in Chronicles of the time of Hezekiah, dealing with the Assyrians who came and laid siege to Jerusalem, and then Hezekiah's sickness, and then Hezekiah's visit from the Babylonian envoys to whom Hezekiah shows his kingdom with kind of a sense of pride. He's showing off a little bit. It's doing a little show and tell. And that last incident is somewhat predictive of the fact that these same Babylonians someday are going to come and take everything away. Careful who you become friends with and show all your stuff to. They just might come and take it. And but for those chapters, and then the big turn in chapter 40, as he looks not only to the return from exile, but a lot of messianic. And those things are sometimes brought together, and that will become clear in the sermon later also. So that's Isaiah the man, prophet, court historian, member of the royal family. That's just some things about his background. And I don't know if anybody wants to go any further into any of that, but those are things we covered last week. It took us an hour to do it last week. All right, authorship of the book. When you look at the book of Isaiah, there are very recognizable divisions. And these, I mentioned one of the changes in what's often called Book 1. Most people don't see that as indication of some different writer, even though that's probably the biggest shift in style you see in the whole thing. But you have three very recognizable parts, so two very recognizable and a third a little bit less so. So part 1 would be chapters 1 to 39, and then part 2 would be chapters 40 through 66. There's some different word choices. There's some differences in style between the two, some differences in content between the two, or emphasis. And as a result, in the 1800s especially, late 1800s, early 1900s, German rationalism in the church started to theorize that there were multiple authors of the book of Isaiah. And it was at a time where, because of the rationalism, people wanted to discount the possibility of anything supernatural, anything miraculous, any possibility of actual real prophecy. And particularly in part 2, chapters 40 to 66, there are a couple passages where Isaiah calls out the king who is going to allow the children of Israel to return from Babylon by name, and says he's going to come from the Medes and the Persians, and his name is going to be Cyrus. And this is about 160 years before Cyrus is on the scene. And because he does that, the rationalist scholars say, well, of course, that's not possible. So obviously, this part of the book was written after the exile, after the return, and it is post-dated this way in order to make it appear that Isaiah actually prophesied it, but since we know the world doesn't work that way, and there's no such thing as real prediction of the future. That couldn't be. That's one of the things they think they find. There are some slight differences in word choice and all between the two sections. But that also leads some of them to speculate about different authors. Even conservative and Bible-believing authors will acknowledge that you do have a shift there at chapter 40. And generally they use that as part 1, part 2. Any given Sunday you come to church here, and my sermon is either going to be part 1, part 2, part 3, or it's going to be part 1, part 2. And once or twice a year, there may be 4 parts. And if I have a really bad week, maybe there just isn't any parts to be found, just an idea. Call that a homily, not a sermon. But, right, and there's a shift between the two. And I'm going to guess that in any given sermon, if you were to pull my grammar apart and pull the vocabulary apart, you might find very recognizable difference. It doesn't mean that 2 different people wrote it. The other thing about the book of Isaiah is we don't have any reason to indicate that this was something that God had him all write at one time. This is, if you go to my shelf in my office and you look at the shelf against this wall, there's a big, long red line of books that takes 2.5 shelves, and that's Luther's works. In the American translation that I have, there are currently 75 volumes. Luther lived before the day of TV and internet, so he actually got some work done. He didn't spend all his time watching YouTube videos. And so, if Luther's works would be a 2-volume set if he lived today, probably. But 75 volumes, just what's been translated into English. And if you go to the German Weimar edition or Erlangen edition, bigger still. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been translated, probably never will be. And that was back in an age when everything a person wrote got saved, and somebody was collecting it and putting it together. But if the Luther scholars will talk about a young Luther and a mature Luther. And sometimes they're overdoing it on that, but a lot of times it's legitimate. If you read the 95 Theses, which started the whole movement of the Reformation, that's a young Luther. And he talks in the 95 Theses about a lot of Roman Catholic doctrine that he's going to reject later on, as though it was still the truth. Because he's figuring this stuff out and developing it as he goes along, right? There are other things. So, one of the things he's criticized late in life, he writes against the Jews. You may know that some people accuse him of being the basis upon which the Nazis committed the Holocaust. And that's not really fair, because Luther didn't write anything about the Jews that everybody else in Europe wasn't saying. And it would appear to be also something of a grumpy old man who's not that far from death, and probably dealing with all kinds of physical problems. He had kidney stones as a regular problem, other physical issues. And he seems to have been disappointed. Early on, he was a person who advocated for preservation of Hebrew and the Hebrew scriptures, whereas a lot of people thought they should just get rid of that. And he was a person who thought that because he was bringing the full gospel back to light instead of the gospel that had been covered over with so much legalism and works righteousness in the Catholic Church, that he was convinced that, so for example, he thought that the gospel as he preached it might help to heal the wound if the Reformation had actually taken hold in a bigger way in what became the Roman Catholic Church. He thought it might heal the wound between the East and the West, so that it might lead to the Orthodox coming back over, because now we got rid of that stuff. And he also had some hopes that perhaps the Jews might be one, because now there wasn't all this Roman Catholic superstition and traditionalism and legalism over top of it. And he was disappointed when that didn't happen.
So it's almost apocalyptic, like, I mean, it's a little apocalyptic. It's like the Mennonites or something having a revolution in a city or something. They expected the millennium.
Yeah. Well, of course, with the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of people every 500 or 1,000 years, everybody thinks that the millennium is going to come, right? And so at the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of people. And Luther writes like he's expecting that to happen during his time. During the Great Awakenings in American history, there was a kind of millennialistic fervor. Mid-1800s, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Mormon Church getting started at that point in time. And what we today in evangelicalism, what has become, pre-tribulational, premillennialism, that all comes out of that period of time in which there's this big millennial fervor. And so the Reformation was another time of that kind of thing. And so that also happens. Well, anyway, my point is that as he's writing for different audiences and different things, the literary style changes. The word choice changes. Luther himself will tell you that when he preaches, and you can see it in his sermons are very earthy. They're not so scholarly. And he says, well, I'm writing for the milkmaid and the cobbler. I'm not writing for the professor sitting in the back of the room. If you want me to go to the university, I'll make it as sharp as it needs to be for anyone back there. But that's not who I'm writing for. And then he's making some comments about the guy who usually preached in the town church, Bugenhagen. He says, Bugenhagen, he tries to impress those guys sitting in the back row from the university. Someday, he says, I'm going to have to write a tract against artful preachers. But he was very earthy, very practical, but very long gospel, of course. But it's a different style in his books of sermons than it is from his university classroom commentaries, because he's writing for a different audience. And that's different from his professional letters that we have volumes of. And that's different from some of the tracts and books that he wrote, like his debate with Erasmus on the bondage of the will. They're all very different styles depending on what he's writing about. Okay, that's a long way of illustrating what I'm talking about here, and I make that point that I just made someplace down further in the notes. But this literary criticism, there are very few authors who would be able to hold up to that, expecting that the same vocabulary, the same way of talking is going to be exactly the same over an entire lifetime of writing, and that you could prove, you take any favorite author who's written more than one book, and they're going to say, oh no, that had to be somebody else because it's different. It's just not, there is no manuscript evidence of different Isaiahs. Jewish tradition knows nothing of it. Nothing in the scriptures, and actually, as we're going to see in just a moment, the scriptures speak just the opposite. But it's not really, I don't believe, a legitimate way of approaching it. They do the same thing with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which are the 5 books of Moses. They have historically always been known as the 5 books of Moses. In fact, while we name them from their Greek translations in the Septuagint, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, most translations in most languages refer to them as like German, Erste Buch, Moses, Zweite Buch, Moses, Dritte Buch, Moses. Basically, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth Moses. Right? And the literary critics, they get in there and they say, oh, sometimes the writer here refers to God as Elohim, which is what we just generally translate God. And sometimes refers to God as Yahweh, the Lord. And then sometimes both. And see, that's 3 different authors. Well, give me a break. Submit my sermons to the same kind of scrutiny, and you're going to figure out there's 10 Vietzes. It just... but you got to earn your PhD to teach in the university, and you have to try to come up with something nobody else has come up with, and especially in the area of theology, that's a dangerous practice. You end up finding stuff that's not there. You end up stuff, and so they go with Isaiah also. So they'll either talk about 2 Isaiahs or 3 Isaiahs. We will acknowledge that there is something of a change of emphasis, and sometimes a change of the way the language goes together a little bit between those 3 sections. We could actually find more, as I pointed out. All of a sudden you go from poetry to history between chapter 36 and 37. But it doesn't mean you have different authors. If I preached to you guys one way. I did last year at the convention a paper, an essay for the convention that was presented to the district as a whole. Well, that's a little bit more formal situation. It's obviously a lot longer, and it's a little different style than I use for my sermons. And then last fall, I also had a pastor's conference sermon. Well, now I've got guys who know Greek and Hebrew and theological jargon. And so if you compare my sermon today with my convention essay, with my pastor's conference essay, again, you're going to find different choices of vocabulary, different grammatical constructions. Maybe for pastor's conference essay, I'm not writing in a modern journalistic style, short, sweet sentences through and through, but a little bit more compound, complex sentences, because the thoughts are a little more complex. I'm not saying you can't keep up with some of that, but it's one thing to read it, it's another one to try to just deliver it and spout it out of your mouth. It's easier to talk in a more short and journalistic style. All right. So answers to the critic's claim, natural growth of an author over a lifetime, we talked about that. Compare young Luther, old Luther, we've talked about that. Uniting features between part 1 and part 2. So as much as there has some things that are apparently different between the two parts, there are some things that would seem to say, well, okay, these things kind of do go together. So for example, references to the Holy One of Israel. This is a favorite term that Isaiah has for God. In Isaiah, you've got that term 12 times in chapters 1 through 39. You have it 14 times in chapters 40 through 66. In the rest of the entire Old Testament, it occurs 5 times. So, if there was 2 different guys, they just happened to both like that way of referring to God. But that's a uniting literary feature between the 2 parts, if you will. Evidence from the rest of Scripture. So, look at John 12:38 to 40 there. I've got the 2 passages that come right in order. This is John writing about Jesus in John 12. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed. Well, we're coming up to Holy Week, and this launches that whole chapter, Isaiah 53, in which the suffering of Jesus is laid out so clearly. So, John attributes to Isaiah 53, second half of the book. Right on the heels of that, he says, for this reason they could not believe, because as Isaiah says elsewhere, he has blinded their eyes and deadened their hearts, so they can neither see with their eyes nor understand with their hearts, nor turn, and I would heal them. Okay, that's Isaiah chapter 6, which is the beginning half of the book. And John is saying they're both Isaiah. So if there was 2 men here, the Jews never saw it or heard of anything of that. In the synagogues, a single Isaiah scroll, they never treated this as anything other than one author. And we have no evidence of anything other than that. Again, there's no manuscript evidence that you have to. The Septuagint, which is translated somewhere around 200 BC, one Isaiah, and what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is nothing to indicate if it's anything other than one man who wrote this. All right, so authorship of the book. We should take it with a sense of integrity. And I could list New Testament quote after New Testament quote. Since Isaiah is a very important book in the Old Testament, there are a lot of references in the New Testament. And without fail, they refer to Isaiah, whether it's from so-called part 1, so-called part 2, or so-called part 3. All attributed to Isaiah. So, unless you think Jesus had it wrong or his apostles had it wrong, we're going to stick with them on this one. The date of writing. So Isaiah's ministry took place under 5 kings. Here you see a partial list of kings of Judah. So he's writing at the time of the divided kingdom, and he is not a prophet sent to the north. He is a prophet for Judah. He lives in Jerusalem. As I said, he's related to the royal family. But he begins, so his father would have been brother, it seems, of Amos, which makes him, related to Uzziah. And it's just at the very end of Uzziah's reign. You remember in Isaiah chapter 6, the call of Isaiah, where Isaiah has that glorious vision of seeing God in the temple and his call. that begins, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted. So his ministry begins at the end of Uzziah's reign up here, and then through Jotham, through Ahaz, through Hezekiah, and then through Manasseh. And we talked last time about the Jewish legend that Isaiah's life ends at the very beginning of Manasseh's reign. And according to Jewish legend, Isaiah was hidden in a hollowed out tree, which Manasseh figured out that's where he was hiding and ordered the tree cut down, and he was sawed in two. And you have a reference to that in the book of Hebrews. Skepticism, the negative critics, okay, because of the Isaiah prophecy regarding Cyrus of Persia, a lot of them will say, well, no, it can't have been during these reigns in the 700s BC. It must have been sometime much later, but we've kind of debunked that already. Isaiah's mentioned Cyrus around 701 BC versus Cyrus' decree allowing the Jews to go home 538. So you've got, 160-year difference there. Okay, Isaiah's times. Contemporary biblical prophets. So Isaiah prophesied at the same time as also Micah in Judah, and there are things that allow you to kind of see that in the content of the prophecies. They borrow a couple of phrases from each other or are inspired to write similar things. So the fact that they are contemporaries shows up along the way there. He's also contemporary of Amos and Hosea in Israel, in the north. Those were the prophets of the same time who were talking to the northern kingdom. And he's also a contemporary of Jonah, whom we all know from Sunday school, right? Who sent to Nineveh. So the prophet sent outside of Israel to the Assyrians, much against his will. I'm sure Jonah thought that he drew the short straw when it came to delivering God's word. He had to actually go outside of Israel. At the time that Isaiah is writing, Assyria is the world superpower. So here's a map of the Middle East at the time. The nation of Babylon, which is going to rise, and that some of Isaiah's prophecies are directed towards, is down here close to the Persian Gulf, most of modern-day Iraq. Susa is where the Persian, Cyrus, who's going to let the Jews go at the end of that, got one of his capitals. And so the Persians were here, the Babylonians were here, and so here you're getting more into Iran. Iran is kind of the ancient kingdom of Persia. But the Assyrians are up here in the north area of that, the far eastern sections of Turkey, and I guess that would be mostly northern Iraq today. Nineveh, where Jonah is sent, is here. But Assyria is the big power of the time. They are the superpower. They are often dealing with Egypt, which is still kind of a superpower. I don't know. Egypt might be kind of like where Russia is today. I think that the two biggest powers in the world today, we're still one of them, but we're not where we were probably. And China has risen a lot, and since the Soviet Union broke up, Russia's not what it used to be. And Egypt is kind of along the lines of not what it used to be, but still a player on the world stage. And so Assyria and Egypt are often pushing against each other. A little bit down the line, a few hundred years from Isaiah, so the Babylonians are going to replace the Assyrians, and then the Persians are going to replace the Babylonians, and then the Persians decide to take all over this and try to invade Greece. And that's where you get the Battle of Thermopylae and the 300, Leonidas and the Spartans and their big holdout, and the Battle of Marathon, and all those battles where the Greeks become ascendant, and then not long after they keep the Persians out of their peninsula, they go on the warpath and they take all of this for themselves. But at the time of Isaiah, Babylon is just getting started. Assyria is the strong superpower of this portion of the world. Egypt is still a major player. Israel is unfortunately, and Judah, in the squeeze between all of that. This is trackless waste. The Arabian desert, nobody wants it. Nobody bothers with it. Nobody lives there. So this is the Fertile Crescent, right? The Tigris and Euphrates rivers up and down here. This is where sometimes it's been said is the cradle of civilization. The Sumerians, way back when, got going between these two rivers here. But this is the prime real estate along this section. So Isaiah is dealing with those things. Assyria comes during Isaiah's lifetime. 722, they carry the northern kingdom from here on up into captivity, and that kingdom essentially disappears. They leave a few stragglers, so when you get to Jesus' day, you still got so you've got Simeon, who meets Jesus in the temple, and then Hannah the prophetess, who also meets, or Anna the prophetess, who meets Simeon or Jesus in the temple, and she is, I didn't look it up, it's tribe of Asher, I think. Somebody can check me on Luke chapter 2. But anyway, so most of her clan would have disappeared with the Assyrian exile, 722 of the northern kingdom. And then during Isaiah's time, the Assyrians push further south. They actually, for a while, take over most of Judah. Jerusalem is the lone holdout city. And it's during the time of King Hezekiah that Jerusalem is under siege, and that God miraculously delivers Assyria a huge blow in that he tolerates them until the general for the Assyrians shouts up at the wall to the man on the wall and says, don't trust your God to deliver you from me, because which of the gods that I faced so far have successfully been able to do so? Your God is going to fall to us just like everyone else did. And that's where God says, all right, it's a bridge too far. We will show you who's boss. And the angel of death is sent through the Assyrian camp, and 185,000 soldiers die in a single night. And they are forced to break camp and retreat. And Jerusalem is spared. And then Hezekiah is able to deliver Judah back again. But that all happens during the time of King Isaiah. So these are the times that he lives in. Now, that's not the whole story of those times. Leading up to that, in Isaiah's early reign, he is prophesying at a time, I think I've got some notes there about it. So relative peace and prosperity under Uzziah, Jotham, and Ahaz from 767 to 715 BC. There's, as a result of that prosperity, we see a lot of the same features I think we see in our own country. In a time of peace and prosperity, people get very comfortable and they don't see as much need for God. It is when times are hard and difficult and painful that people say, I need help. Maybe God will help. So during this time, there's a lack of interest in things spiritual. There's just a general turn away from things spiritual. There's a rise of oppression and justice, because if I'm not really thinking about God very much, I get a little full of myself and I start to think that I can just push my way. I can bully people around. If I can get a little bit of money, pay off a few judges, get a little political clout and power, I can do pretty much what I want. And so Isaiah lived at a time in which this had to be confronted quite often as well. And you get this out of the prophets to the north. Hosea and Amos are very much confronting the people of their time in the north before Assyria arrives about the injustice, about the oppression of the poor by the rich, and those who have some clout and power. But these are things that one sees, especially when belief in God starts to fade or fail. Reliance on foreign allies. So during this time that Isaiah is prophesying, when the Assyrians are coming and threatening, in Judah there's a temptation to go to Egypt, which is the other world superpower, and to depend on them to bail them out. And it is during the time of King Ahaz that Isaiah has to take Ahaz to task about refusing God's help, because he's going to trust in military might and the arm of man. And it is out of that context that you get the great prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, the sign that's given to Ahaz that God's going to spare him. the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and call him Emmanuel. Go ahead.
Why is Egypt yellow and Assyria is both yellow? Does that mean Assyria controls Egypt, or
Well, so
what does that mean in that legend there?
So Assyria had successful pushes into Egypt at various times. So this would be them at their highest extent, although
Yeah.
Egypt always, it's a long way away, and they
Right.
weren't able to maintain it. And so Egypt would be
Right.
independent and had enough in terms of resources, military know-how to push back quite often and push them back out and up. Which is why Israel also, or Judah, looked to the Egyptians as, okay, these people also are trying to fight against the Assyrians. Maybe we should team up with them, and maybe then we can maintain our independence, because the Egyptians seem to know something about doing this. You'll notice in the key here, you get a little different color. So this is the divided kingdom, but Judah isn't, it's like an island within that empire.
Yeah.
During that time, the Assyrians, the Egyptians so occupy the Assyrian attention that they aren't able to give their full force against Jerusalem and against Judah the way they might like. The Egyptians weren't pushing back quite so much when they came through Israel in 722. Yep. And then hypocritical and formalistic worship. So for those who remained spiritual, and for some of those who weren't so spiritual, but it was the tradition. And so the people would go to the temple and they would bring the sacrifices and they'd celebrate the Passover and they would go through the motions. But it was all external. There was a thin veneer of religion and spirituality placed over a very secular kind of culture at that time. And it didn't have any depth. And this is also addressed by the prophets, not just Isaiah, but Isaiah also, the hypocrisy, the lack of a real faith on the part of the people. There are some. Well, let's say Isaiah sometimes becomes very colorful in approaching and addressing this kind of thing, and we'll get some examples of that along the way. Another thing about Isaiah's time: strained relations between Israel and Syria. So not only is Judah trying to fight off the Assyrians, not only are they thinking about lining up with the Egyptians, but there is towards, at the very end here, between Israel and Judah, some bad blood to the point where there is one incursion, at least, of the Israelites, the northern kingdom down into the southern kingdom. And they have tied up with the kingdom of Syria, which is about where modern-day Syria is, Damascus, in order to do so. And at the time of King Ahaz, there is that going on also. So you've got, in fact, I mentioned that. So it's in Hezekiah, really, where you've got Assyria having siege. It's not so much Assyria that Ahaz goes to Egypt or thinking about going to Judah over. It's actually this little incursion of Syria and Israel that he's looking to the Egyptians for help with first. But that remains a temptation along the way. So if you look in 2 Chronicles 28, 6-8, there's one major war under Ahaz. And one of the bad things that happened during the war, 120,000 soldiers, according to the biblical account, of Judah die in a series of battles. And the northern kingdom actually comes and takes 200,000 residents of Judah captive. And then, I'd have to look it up again. Is it prophet? Or just wiser people said, wait a minute. Judah, we were God's people, or are God's people, and Judah is too. It's probably not a good idea for us to do this to our not so distant relatives and people who play a bigger role in God's big plan of salvation. And the northern kingdom's actually convinced to send these people back and to let them go, so they don't hold them. But that's a major problem with the southern kingdom, and Ahaz was not a great ruler at that time. And then, according to legend, as I mentioned, King Manasseh executed Isaiah by having him sawed in two. Seems to be a reference to that in Hebrews 11. We talked about that a little last time, I believe. I think I made some references to it. It's Jewish legend, so do what you will with legend. There's a reference to someone being sawed in two as a great hero of faith in Hebrews 11, verse 37. It seems to be a reference to this, so it seems to have some scriptural backing. And again, just because something doesn't have, it's not as though the Bible is the only true things there are, right? So just because it's not in the Bible itself doesn't mean we should necessarily doubt it, right? There's plenty of good history that seems to be reasonably accurate that doesn't come out of the Bible. And so this would be one of those kinds of things. I don't see that we have a good reason to doubt it, especially when it seems you have an allusion in the book of Hebrews itself. Okay. Questions about Isaiah's times? Some of that at the end I went through there because I think that it helps us to see that there is some practicality. There will be plenty of not very difficult application, some low-hanging fruit when we work through Isaiah because his times don't look so different.
Bad times are followed. Let's say, good times are followed by worse, and bad times are followed. Anyway,
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's somewhat cyclical.
Yeah.
But you have some of the same kinds of features that go on from the spiritual point of view. Prosperity is not usually religion's friend, right? Prosperity tends to work the other direction. We forget God when things go well.
It's like a decline. It's just
It is
a period of decline.
It is a period of decline. Features of Isaiah's message. So we've talked about, they've got a lot of messianic prophecies. You know a lot of them already. Chapter 53, which we'll hear during Holy Week, is one of the big ones. Christmas time, Isaiah 7, others. Judgment of Judah's sins. That's a big part of what he has to talk about. But also judgment of surrounding nations. We're going to move through that fairly quickly. We maybe just make some comments on the concept when we get there. The main message of Christianity is for Christians, or those who are trying to win to Christianity. But that does not preclude the idea that sometimes God has a message for the wicked that he knows he's never going to get also. And expectations of them. And criticisms of what they're doing. And we'll see, we will touch on some of those things in this longer section in chapter, the 20s and 30s. You see it, 24 to 35 of these judgments, 13 to 35. Judgments on the nations, judgments on the earth. The failure of Assyria, chapter 36, Hezekiah's illness, restoration, 37 and 38, the introduction of Babylon in chapter 39. And that's plenty for us to digest right now. Part 2, chapters 40 to 66, we'll look at that outline when we get to the later part of the book. Okay. Questions on the introduction? Went through it a little bit more quickly.
That was a hefty introduction.
What's that?
So that was a hefty introduction.
All right, plenty there to chew on.
Class.
So these things will be referenced as we go along through the book further. But it's good to have some of those things in hand going in as we try to make sense of what Isaiah is saying. So next time we will jump into Isaiah chapter 1 itself and get into the text.